Well, shrinking oil and natural gas prices last year forced Oklahoma companies to cut more than 11,000 jobs and slash oil field spending. A downturn in the energy sector that's reverberating throughout Oklahoma's economy. And while no energy state is immune to global economic shifts, Oklahoma's state government has been particularly vulnerable because of recent efforts to slash taxes. As of January 1, Oklahoma's top income tax rate fell a quarter of a point from 5.25 to a flat 5%. But don't expect a big financial windfall come tax time. Households earning the state's median income of $45,000 will save less than $29 over the course of the entire year, while even the wealthiest of Oklahoma households with incomes of over $1 million will save just about $2,000. But when you add all that up, according to the Oklahoma Tax Commission, the tax cut will cost the state $147 million in lost revenue. Now, in past years, lawmakers have been plugging smaller budget holes by looking under every seat cushion for one-time monies. But this year, the hole's just too big and we're out of couches, which has prompted State Treasurer Ken Miller to speak out over the way his fellow Republicans are funding state government. And I was able to sit down with him after he spoke at this year's Economic Outlook Conference. Do we have a looming structural crisis in the way we approach our state budget?
I'm not going to call it a crisis, but I do think that we have structural problems with our budget that can be addressed. I don't think that they can be addressed in this upcoming session because I think that we're going to have too big of a budget hole, and so that will be reserved for a better economic situation than we have today. But no, I think we're short of a crisis, but we do need to have increased recognition of that structural problem so that we can correct it down the road with a multi-year process. We did that with pensions, with greater recognition of the pension problem. The legislature recognized that. They took steps to correct it, and now we're on a better pathway with our pensions than we were. The same can be done with the one-time use of funds or the non-recurring revenue problem that we have, but I wouldn't call it a crisis at this point.
So how did we get here?
Well, I think we got here because, we were using some suboptimal financial practices during the Great Recession. And I think during a time of extreme fiscal distress that is appropriate. You do things to make the budget work any way that you can. I was the budget chairman in the House during the Great Recession. We did things that we would have preferred not to do, like using revolving fund money, using federal dollars, cutting agencies, yes, and all sorts of things that we would have rather not done, but we had to make the budget balanced because constitutionally that's not an option. The problem is those suboptimal practices continued during the economic expansion that followed. And so we've become dependent on using these suboptimal practices, using this non-recurring revenue source during times of good economic situations and during times of bad economic situations.
For a government that's led across the board by elected conservatives, what you're describing really doesn't sound that conservative.
Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. I don't care who you are, right? And so you can't continue to reduce recurring revenues and increase expenditures. Eventually, that's going to cause a structural problem, and I think that's where we're heading.
I want to read you a quote from your November newsletter in the commentary, and it's fairly simple. Common sense dictates that until the state proves it can live within its means, meaning its revenues and taxes, it really should stop reducing them. Have we cut taxes enough?
Well, we've cut taxes enough unless it's going to be revenue neutral. Again, it goes back to you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't continue to cut your recurring revenues, which the income tax is a source of recurring revenues. In fact, it's the largest source of recurring revenues for the state. You can't continue to cut that unless you're willing to cut spending along with it or you're willing to cut business incentives along with it. So we've reached the point where tax cuts that are not revenue neutral can no longer happen, in my judgment.
Mm-hmm. Now, trying to generate new money, there is the 1 cent sales tax that's being proposed and looks possibly to go in front of a vote of the people. Reflect on that and reflect on I think everyone that we listen to today says that education may well be being starved of money, and the future of our state may be being starved of money right now.
Yeah, clearly, I think that education needs to be funded better in Oklahoma. I don't think it's the only thing that needs to be funded better in Oklahoma. In fact, I think if you look at our comparisons with other states on all of the core functions of government, that we could do a better job in funding those. But clearly, education, I'm an educator, so I think it's critical for our state's success. We need to fund it better. I think the proposal, the 1 cent sales tax, reflects the desire from many to find a recurring revenue source to fund teacher pay raises. We've had proposals from this group or another group that's finding ways to find money under the couch cushion to fund a teacher pay raise, but it's like for 1 year or 2 years, and that's not going to work long term. You have to have a recurring revenue source to fund recurring expenditures, which is what we have to have a structurally balanced budget going forward. So I think that proposal is just born of frustration from a lot of folks saying that we need to fund teacher pay raises, but never coming up with a real mechanism to do that. So I think this proposal will be judged on its merits. Though the cost of imposing that 1 cent increase in the sales tax outweigh the benefit, or the benefit outweigh the cost, the voters will decide that. But I certainly understand the desire to have a recurring source to fund teacher pay raises.
How do we fix it then? How do we fix what looks to be, whether it be a crisis or not, a structural problem?
Well, again, I think once there's awareness, increased recognition of the structural problem, and I think that awareness is starting to catch on. I think more and more people are understanding that we can't continue to use one-time sources like unclaimed property money and revolving fund balances and this, that, and the other to fund ongoing expenditures. So I think the recognition is getting there. With programs like this, the recognition will continue to take place not just in the legislature, but with our people out in normal, everyday Oklahoma will be aware of the problem and communicate that to their representatives and senators and those of us that work on their behalf at the state capitol. So awareness is always the first step, right? And I think the awareness is getting there. And so then after the economy gets back on sound footing, after we get past this soft patch and the oil patch, then I think that we can get a multi-year approach to weaning ourselves off of the one-time use where recurring revenues match recurring expenditures. I think it will happen. It's just a matter of time.
Is this an example of conservative ideology running smack dab into economic realities?
Well, I can tell you, when I was first elected, I was much more ideological than I am today, and being the budget chairman helped give me a dose of reality. And so ideology is all good and fine, but the rubber meets the road with reality when you have to fund these core services on which our people depend. And so, I think, whether it's you want to talk in philosophical terms or ideological terms, at the end of the day, what really matters is the dollars and cents. Do you have enough recurring funding to match your recurring expenditures? I think by the very fact that the legislature is augmenting the budget with $300 to $400 million of alternative sources of revenue on top of the certified amount, that is de facto admittance that they don't believe there's enough revenue to fund the amount of government services that they desire to fund. And so we have to just get back and lay aside politics and just focus on policy and make sure that we have the amount of revenues to fund the core government services that our private sector depends on.
Yeah, does that mean being just intellectually honest with voters and saying, this is how much money we have, these are the choices that we've made, and this is what we have to live within?
I think being intellectually honest with the voters helps very much because the voters will make the right decision if they have the information. And I think sometimes we don't provide the right information to voters because we're either being silent about some ridiculous proposals that are floated out there by folks who get a lot of attention for those, or through our rhetoric, frankly. Sometimes our rhetoric can be irresponsible when we know better. And I think that telling people that you can always lower taxes and great things will happen every single time you do that is not being intellectually honest. There is a certain amount of revenues that are required to fund education, to fund public safety, to fund transportation infrastructure and to fund public health. Those things are necessary, and not necessary because we're just trying to be good people and fund government services, but the private sector is dependent on the public sector's foundation to provide a quality workforce, to provide health, provide infrastructure, and to provide public safety. Those things are absolutely critical to the private sector's success, and government plays a role in that. And so we just have to get real about what it is that government needs to provide to support the private sector and make sure that we have the revenues to do that.
Treasurer Miller, thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
So how did we find ourselves moving ahead with a tax cut in the midst of a revenue failure and a projected $900 million shortfall? Well, the technical answer comes from David Blatt at Oklahoma's Policy Institute. In 2014, the legislature approved Senate Bill 1246 that tied future tax cuts to a revenue trigger. Specifically, the bill stated that the tax cut would be triggered if, as of last December, fiscal year 2016 revenues were expected to be higher than the estimated revenues for 2014. As can be seen from this graph, 12 months ago it appeared that revenues would in fact grow slightly this year, so the trigger mechanism kicked in. But by February, it was clear that this year's revenues would in fact be lower than the previous years. But because Senate Bill 1246 wasn't written to respond to changing circumstances, we find ourselves with less revenue and a growing deficit.